All right, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I know it's been an absolutely crazy week. If you are paying attention to budgets in Western Canada, obviously there's a lot going on in the world this week. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to just check in here. So let's get started. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Melissa Caouette. I was born and raised in Alberta, and I've worked in government relations and as a political staffer and as a bureaucrat and in the private sector, doing public policy work for the past decade. I work with clients all over Western Canada, particularly in Alberta and British Columbia. I provide strategic advice, government relations, and research and analysis services to folks who are looking to affect change with them. Just as a reminder, I'm going to be sending out a recording of this webinar along with the deck and as well as a briefing note for all of the registered attendees. So you can look for that in your inbox in the next day or so. And if we're talking about anything today that is confusing to you, I just want to remind everybody that I did write a blog post a couple weeks ago with Trevor Toome, who really helps unpack and explain a lot of the different things that happen in budgets, because I know that it can be complicated even for people who are looking at these things all the time. So feel free to jump into the chat and ask questions. I'll try and get to as many as possible. And then of course, if you've got questions after, you can reach out to me directly. I will put my email on the last slide so you can take a screenshot of that. So without further delay, let's get started here. So the purpose of today's call is not to get into a super deep dive on absolutely everything that happened in the budget. I've only allocated 30 minutes because I know people are busy. So this is really just a primer for people who want to know generally what's going on and some of the major themes and trends to look for, so you can sound smart within your organization or to your family and friends if that's a topic of discussion that you like. So just to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about, we will go over some key themes. We will jump into some of the key fiscal metrics and economic indicators. Then we'll talk about some key investments, as well as the political context, and then a few tips for people who are in the industry who want to leverage the budget for their government relations goals. So here are the key themes from the budget as I see them. So we've got balance. We'll get into talking a bit about that, but Alberta had remarkable fiscal performance last year and was able to balance the budget for budget 2022. So that's really exciting. And there'll be subsequent surpluses for the next 3 years. Alberta also stayed really strong to the 3 fiscal anchors that were introduced last year. If you'll recall, Minister Taves started to talk about the way in which Alberta was going to look at their finances. So instead of targeting just balanced budgets in a time where oil prices were really low, economic activity was slowing, we were in the middle of a pandemic, they talked about aligning per capita spending with the rest of the major provinces in Canada through the McKinnon report recommendations. So those come through targeted spending reductions to make sure per capita spending isn't so out of line with other provinces like British Columbia and Ontario. They also talked about keeping net debt to GDP ratio below 30%, just given the fact that if it's not possible to balance, trying to keep debt within a sort of manageable range. And then as well, they wanted to reestablish a path to balance after the pandemic, but they were able to do that sooner. So that's a stroke in the right direction for them. As well as diversification, I think there's probably different views on the extent to which the government invested in diversification, but there's absolutely investments in tech, financial technology, film, hydrogen. So there are investments that are outside of the traditional oil and gas sector, but to say that the government went full throttle on diversification, totally moving away from oil and gas, that definitely didn't happen, and that's probably never going to happen under this government, but there were definitely some targeted spending. As well, a huge theme for the budget is job growth. And so a lot of the strategic investments that we see are not necessarily just random influxes into the economy. They're really targeted to try and develop skills through the education system and through reskilling throughout the economy so that people can actually have the skills that they need to thrive in today's labor market. So here is probably one of the most impressive slides and results from the budget. For those that don't know, budgets are forward-looking documents. So when the budget was tabled last year, it was called Budget 2021, and the government made assumptions about what they expected to see throughout fiscal 2021-2022. Now, when you're making those assumptions at the beginning of the year, things can change. And so that's why budgets do change and adjust at times. But the way that the budget adjusted as the year played out for 2021 adjusted in a really positive way. I've outlined here what the government forecast. So those are the gray boxes under budget 2021. So that's what they thought was going to happen last February when they tabled the budget. The 2021-22 forecast is what they forecast will actually happen by the end of March, which is the end of the government's fiscal year. So absolutely incredible rebounds for the province. You'll note that resource revenue from budget 2021 was projected at $2 billion, and it came in billions of dollars higher, which is a huge reason why the government was able to balance this year. As well, they thought they were going to have an $18.2 billion deficit last year. That's going to only end up being $3.2 billion. So huge improvements in that fiscal situation. That's $15 billion lower than they thought it was going to be, and $2.6 billion lower than the last fiscal update that happened at the end of last year. You also see expenses a bit higher. They attribute these expenses to investments in crop insurance and that kind of thing. So they actually didn't do too bad on that either. So this is screenshot. This is a really awesome metric. And you'll see as well the net debt to GDP ratio significantly less than they thought it would be. So if you'll recall, they're been targeting below 30%. They're almost half of that now. So really solid performance for budget 2021. All right, now we look at budget 2022. So this is what the government has projected for fiscal year 2022-2023. So these are the projections that they're making based on available information for what's going to happen over the next fiscal year, which begins on April 1st of 2022 here, so just in a month or so. So you'll see huge improvements. Next year is going to be a $511 million surplus. And for the 2 years after that, 23-24 is a $900 million surplus. 24-25 is a $700 million surplus. This is the first time that the government has had a balanced budget since 2014, and the first time that they have projected a surplus since 2008. So it's a really huge turnaround for the province, and I think a lot of people are feeling really excited about it. Revenues are going to be $18 billion more than projected in 21-22. That's largely due to increasing in oil prices, commodity prices, more people employed, higher personal and corporate income tax revenue, and anticipated federal transfers that are going to be coming in. I'll note as well that there were no new taxes introduced in budget 2022 in terms of big taxes changes either way for corporate or personal. You'll note that they had the Alberta job creation tax cut, which targeted to lower the corporate tax rate from 12 to 8%. They sped that up in the pandemic to give assurance to companies that was still a commitment that they were going to follow through. Interestingly enough, when you look at how much spending increases were, so we talked a couple slides ago about the importance of fiscal anchors to this government. So getting spending under control, huge priority. The spending increases year over year were down to less than 1% per year. To give you some context, in the previous government, spending increases were increasing at 4% per year. And so this government suggests that if they had continued to spend at that rate, they would have a $6 billion deficit. So spending is definitely playing into the ability to balance the budget even more than just oil prices. And you'll note as well that Alberta is going to have the lowest net debt to GDP ratio in Canada. And they expect in 2022, they'll fully recover from all of the economic contractions that happened in 2014. Since they do anticipate that there's going to be future surpluses, the plan, according to Minister Taves, is to put those surpluses into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund instead of reintroducing them back into general operating, which creates just a bit more sustainability for the province. So how did the government balance? So it's a combination of a couple of things. So oil is above $90 a barrel today, and so that's playing a huge difference. Their projections were pretty conservative in the budget at $70 per barrel. So a lot of people thinking that the economic situation could be even better in the future as things unfold. But it was a combination of higher revenues and spending controls. So higher commodity prices, higher personal and corporate income tax revenues, higher investment income, and then of course controlling that spending as well. One of the criticisms of the budget that you could have is that the government is still pretty highly dependent on resource revenue. I don't think that is going to go away. I think that the sort of political approach for this government is to try to diversify slowly in a way that doesn't displace sector altogether. I don't think that you're going to see a full sort of transition, nor should you, especially what we're seeing in the world. We're going to definitely need Alberta's oil. All right, so let's get into talking to Alberta at Work. So this was the name of the budget and also a huge theme throughout the budget. So investment in putting Albertans back to work, reskilling them, giving them the training and tools to have jobs, to get better jobs, integrate education with the job market, and that will be done with $600 million investment over 3 years. So this investment isn't just targeted to one ministry. So it's not just coming from jobs, economy, innovation. It's across the sector. So you'll see education, advanced education, community and social services, a lot of different sectors that they're focusing on. So they want to make sure that also there is good information on what is happening in Alberta's labor market. So they have invested $15 million to have better information on what kind of jobs are available, what employers are in need of, to make sure that education is aligned with job market expansion. The first one, building foundations, that is focused on making sure that education systems are at the K to 12 level are teaching kids what the job market needs. And so they're going to do this by ensuring that there's pathways from K to 12 education to post-secondary. They're going to do this by investing $25 million in operating expenses and targeted programming, $47 million in capital expenses. And also in the throne speech on Tuesday, they announced that they will expand the use of charter schools in the province. So you could have more targeted institutions under that regime. Developing skills. This is going to be about developing skills for people within the workforce. So helping them to reskill, get jobs, all that kind of stuff. We talk about seeking employment. So this is going to be done through community and social services. This is going to be through getting folks soft skills training, language training for folks who want to work, but maybe are lacking the skills that they need to get a job that they are applying for or that they want. When we talk about career advancement, this is going to be focused largely in terms of post-secondary education and micro-credentials. They're looking to provide bursaries for low-income Albertans and making sure that folks who want to have career advancement and need skills to do so will be able to. We talk about investment attraction. This is going to be largely focused on the government's investment and growth strategy. So lots of investments in technology and quantum science, as well as some targeted rural economic development targets as well. So I guess I would just say that if you are an organization that has goals that would align with one of these, I would really target when you're talking to government around these pillars, because this is something that they're going to be really focused on. All right, capital plan investment. So capital plan is investments that the government makes in typically large infrastructure projects. And so these are typically over a longer period of time. You have to plan in advance for them. I'll note as well that Alberta is doing capital planning a little bit differently than they used to. Typically, it's a lot of work to get your project into a capital plan. Typically, it's not months, it's years of commitment to showing what your value proposition is and how it's going to help the economy. Alberta has now transitioned to a 20-year capital plan, so they are now planning strategically 20 years in advance for infrastructure projects. So that's supposed to create a little bit of certainty and stability in some of what's happening in capital planning and just provide a little bit more predictability. All of the capital plan investments that they've made here are, again, circling back to support job and economic growth. You'll see that there is money for broadband strategy. So that's a huge part, especially with the pandemic, of making sure that rural and remote communities and Indigenous communities have access to broadband to participate in the digital economy. $1.8 billion for roads and bridges. You'll see they've also made an interesting investment of $15 million over 3 years for the Aboriginal Business Investment Fund, so helping Indigenous communities through economic empowerment. That is different than the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, for those that are wondering. You also see there's investments in post-secondary too. So they're giving $41 million to SAIT. They are giving $59 million to the University of Calgary's Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, because there's a huge shortage of veterinarians in the province right now. They're also giving $251 million to support the new construction and modernization of schools. So investments are still happening there. In total, they are also giving $744 million for the Springbank off-stream reservoir in Calgary, which has been something since the 2013 floods. It's been really important. And then as well, $10 million over 2 years for the Clean Hydrogen Center of Excellence. So talking a bit about that diversification aspect of things. $20.2 billion investment over 3 years for the capital plan. For health, so obviously health has been a huge focus for the past 2 years with the pandemic. This has not been an issue unique to Alberta in terms of healthcare system capacities. This is something that has been happening all across Canada, where gaps in healthcare system capacity are definitely being felt with the increased pressures from COVID. So the government is going to boost operational healthcare spending of $515 million this year to provide more. I'll also note that the Council of the Federation, which is all of the premiers across Canada who sit on a council to advocate to the federal government, healthcare has been a huge issue for those folks as well. That's chaired by Premier Horgan in British Columbia. The provincial government receives federal transfers from the government of Canada in the form of the Canada Health Transfer, and provinces have been advocating really hard for it to be allocated to them because provinces are the ones responsible for healthcare. So we haven't seen what's going to happen in the federal budget yet. So it's tough to say what that will look like, but we'll definitely be watching it for that in the next few weeks for sure. Another huge point of contention in the health budget is the physician compensation negotiations that are still underway. Those have not concluded yet, but the government is definitely making steps in the right direction. They're providing $90 million to help attract rural doctors, and then also $5 million to help attract rural nurses. Those negotiations are ongoing, and we'll see where those go. Of note, a really important infrastructure investment that was made through health is the Red Deer Regional Hospital redevelopment. That's a $193 million investment over 3 years to help redevelop that hospital. And then as well, they are giving $750 million in COVID contingency. So that's if the pandemic takes another turn, but in this amount as well as money allocated for the Alberta Surgical Wait Time Initiative. So this is going to be an initiative centered at getting rid of the backlog and helping relieve some of the pressures that exist currently on the healthcare system due to canceled surgeries and just general backup. You'll see here, education is receiving an increase. They are allocating $191 million over 3 years for curriculum updates. For those of you that pay attention to this sort of space, there is a new K-6 curriculum being implemented in September. Most of it was moving forward, except for some aspects of the social studies curriculum, which were quite contentious. Again, the government's also said that they're going to expand the instances of charter schools. So you'll see funding for that as well in the budget. In terms of advanced education, the grants that most post-secondary institutions are receiving, for example, for the U of A, the U of C, are decreasing because the McKinnon panel suggested that post-secondary institutions need to do more with less in terms of funding. That's a sort of political discussion that we can have at a different time, but that's part of the planning of the money that's being allocated to post-secondaries. They've also, for the past 2 to 3 years, been doing a new strategy. So it's called Alberta 2030, Building Skills for Jobs. So this is really an effort to make sure that post-secondary institutions in the province are meeting the needs of the labor market and the economy. So making sure that folks in institutions that are targeting sectors and industries that are growing are receiving funding to support that labor market demand. And as well, you'll see that the University of Alberta also receives some money for their brain center, in addition to the University of Calgary getting money for their veterinary school. Municipal Affairs. There were municipal elections last fall, so you have new mayors across the province, and notably in Edmonton and Calgary. This sort of represents, I think, a renewed relationship between the province and the municipalities, some for the better, some for the. But one thing to just keep in mind is that MSI funding is being phased out in the next 3 years. They've funded it at $1.7 billion for the next 3 years, but at the end of that period, it will be replaced with a new funding framework called the Local Government Fiscal Framework. And so that is currently underway with municipalities. They're negotiating that and how that will work. That's obviously a huge concern for municipalities because they have very limited ability to raise taxes. The only mechanism that they have is through property taxes. And so they really do depend on predictability of transfers from the province to make plans and investments for things that are important to the municipal space. You'll note as well some of the frustrations with the 911 systems being centralized. There's $23 million for that to try and resolve some of this. You'll notice not listed here, but the municipal elections last year had 2 questions on equalization and daylight savings. Equalization stemmed from a Fair Deal panel report, which talked about different ways that Alberta can assert its autonomy within Canada. One of the ways that was suggested, and some research has been done on it, is for a Alberta Provincial Police Service. So they've done an analysis on this. They've conducted consultations. This is also a really contentious issue for municipalities because it just creates a little bit of uncertainty in terms of funding and next steps there. I don't know what next steps are going to be with that. It was mentioned in the throne speech, but there's no tangible next steps there. But that's another issue that's really important to municipalities as well. Just briefly here, we'll talk about social services, the historic childcare agreement that was made with the federal government. The province has $666 million towards that in this budget. So that's about reducing childcare costs for families who should already be seeing some of those reductions in their monthly childcare bills. They're also putting another $20 million in mental health funding, and this is in addition to the $140 million that they allocated last budget. So that's still a huge priority for this government, as well as $118 million for affordable housing, which is a huge initiative that happens between the provincial government and municipal governments. It's an ongoing issue that the government's put some money in here. All right, so let's get into some of the political context of the budget. So budgets obviously are inherently political documents. They don't happen in a vacuum. They're happening within the context of a bunch of other things that have been outlined. On Tuesday, the government introduced their throne speech. And for those of you who don't know, the throne speech outlines the legislative and policy agenda for this session, reiterated a lot of key commitments that they've made with respect to the Alberta Recovery Plan. But one thing that I will talk about with respect to throne speech is affordability of utility prices. So they did announce in the throne speech that they will be getting rid of the balancing pool. All of this is integrated with rising utility prices. They're going to introduce a consumer protection for natural gas prices if they go above 6.5 or $6.50 a gigajoule. So there are some of that was addressed absolutely in the throne speech, amongst other things. Popularity. So this budget is going to, I think, do a lot for the government's popularity. The government has obviously been struggling throughout the pandemic, as all governments across Canada have been, with their approval ratings. And Premier Kenney has been no stranger to that. I think, though, that for folks who are outside of Alberta, things tend to get rosier as the finances get rosier. So I do think that with more people getting back to work, and with more economic activity happening, a balanced budget, I think that this will change some of those popularity numbers for sure. But Premier Kenney also has to face some internal politics. So on April 9th, there will be a special general meeting in Red Deer, which will hold a leadership review for the Premier. So he needs to receive at least 50%. If he does not, then there will automatically be a leadership race triggered. I think there's a lot of different ideas on what the results of this will be. I think that the Premier will prevail. I think that he will survive this leadership review. And I think once that happens, I think that we're going to jump right into a period of pre-election mode. So if you think of a lot of the themes that were covered here in the budget, a lot of it can really be transitioned into campaign material in terms of a balanced budget, key investments, no new taxes. I know that the idea of a provincial sales tax is often brought up in Alberta, but for those outside of Alberta, I would just say that a provincial sales tax is way less about the money and way more about the pride in Alberta, for Albertans at least. So there's a lot of people who really take pride in that, including the government. And so I don't think that we're going to see anything like that before the next election. The government could introduce another budget before the next election, but they don't necessarily have to. The next election is scheduled for May of 20 next year. They could go earlier. They could opt not to introduce a budget and change that around. There's a lot of different options that they have available to them. But what does this mean for you and your organization? One of the things that I think is really unfortunate is that budget time is such a busy and engaging time for government that oftentimes stakeholders, I don't think, are taking advantage of this time. I think people are thinking, oh, government's really busy, we don't want to bother them. But I think one of the things that you need to do if you do have stakeholders, and everybody on this call who works at a business does have stakeholders, is to just make sure that people that are affected by the budget obviously know about this budget, that they're giving you feedback, that you are able to take in everything that's happened and digest how it was felt. I think you can read things in the media, but you have to actually go talk to people to understand exactly how what's being announced and projected in the budget is going to affect them. So make sure you're engaging their stakeholders. It's fresh. you get the information. And then if you did get something that you wanted in the budget, or you are seeing things move in the positive direction that you want, make sure that you tell the government that. I think it's just people, I think that governments don't have souls, and governments are made up by people, and people appreciate it when you recognize when they've delivered on promises or when you've made progress on certain things. So make sure to say thank you if you receive something that you didn't. And if you didn't receive what you wanted, then you could communicate that in a respectful way. But I guess the most important thing is to take this opportunity to start preparing for the next election. Platform development will be underway immediately after the leadership review, if it isn't already. And so if you have ideas that you want the government to think about in terms of the next election, make sure you're thinking those through, and make sure that those ideas are not completely divorced from what's included in this budget. You have the most success with government relations efforts when you build on things that the government has already committed to want to do. So whether that's thematically or funding wise, make sure that you're not just proposing outlandish ideas if you don't have a plan on how you're going to execute those. So that is it for today's webinar. Thank you so much for everybody for joining. I know we're 1 minute early. If anybody has questions on follow-up or next steps at all, let me know. Here's my information and we can go from there. And of course, if you have any questions in terms of how to affect change with government, let me know and I'd be happy to chat with you. So thanks everybody so much for joining, and we will see you later.